vampire was begging for blood on the street. He had not fed for 3 days and 3 nights, and finally set his sights on a passing pedestrian. But before he could make a move, he was subdued on the spot by patrol guards. So the question is, how did vampires end up in such a miserable state? In 2019, a mysterious plague swept across the globe. Nearly 90% of humanity was infected and transformed into vampires who survived on blood. Only a small number of people possessed immunity and remained fully human, but most of them were kept captive by vampires and reduced to living blood sources. As time passed, more and more vampires fell into starvation. Some would rather expose themselves to sunlight, turn to ashes, than continue enduring the suffering. Even so, the vampire population continued to grow, while blood supplies became increasingly scarce. To survive, most vampires could only get by on diluted blood distributed at supply stations. At this time, renowned hematologist Edward received orders from his employer. He was tasked with developing a substitute for human blood. Although he was a vampire himself, he still sympathized with humans. As a result, he survived on small amounts of animal blood. Several months passed, yet the research showed no progress. However, during the experiments, they uncovered a terrifying fact. If vampires were deprived of human blood for too long, their bodies would gradually deteriorate and eventually become mindless vampire creatures. Early one morning, while driving home, Edward's hearing suddenly changed. Countless sounds flooded into his mind. In a moment of distraction, his car lost control and struck several pedestrians. Edward quickly got out to check on them, only to discover that they were actually humans. Just then, the sound of police sirens echoed from the distance. To keep them from being discovered, Edward quickly hid them inside his car. Under his protection, the group managed to escape safely. After returning home, Edward was about to rest when his younger brother unexpectedly showed up. He had come specifically to celebrate Edward's birthday. This time, his brother brought a special gift. It was highly concentrated human blood, but Edward refused to accept it. Instead, he poured it straight down the drain. Seeing this, his brother became furious and smashed the blood vial against the wall. However, the scent of blood quickly attracted a feral vampire wandering nearby. The brothers joined forces and barely managed to subdue it. Meanwhile, vampire attacks became increasingly frequent, and blood supplies continued to decline. As investors began pulling out one after another, the blood collection company fell into crisis. Edward's employer kept pressuring him, urging him to develop a blood substitute as soon as possible. Just when Edward had run out of options, the human woman he had rescued suddenly appeared, and she seemed to possess another solution to the crisis. When a vampire is exposed to sunlight, their body will instantly burn to ashes. But if that's the case, how do they go outside during the day? This was a fully enclosed vehicle. The driver monitored the outside through external cameras. After the vehicle stopped beside a large tree, Edward quickly put on his protective gear. After making sure it was safe, he cautiously stepped out of the car. Led by Ellie, Edward met William, who was hiding behind the tree. After a brief conversation, Edward learned that William had been a vampire for 9 years. What puzzled him was, how had William become human again? Before he could get an answer, Ellie was brought over at knife point by Edward's brother. At the same time, several military vehicles were speeding toward them. With blood supplies running critically low, even just 2 humans would be a valuable catch. In the chaos, William seized the opportunity and knocked out Edward's brother. Then he drove away with the other 2. After a dangerous chase, William risked everything by driving across a broken railway track. He finally escaped the pursuing vampires. After returning to their hidden base, Edward finally learned how William had become human again. It all started one day, when William was speeding down a highway. Because he had gone too long without human blood, his mind had become increasingly unstable. As a result, his car crashed into a guardrail. He was thrown from the vehicle. The moment he was exposed to sunlight, his body burst into flames. Fortunately, he fell into the water moments later. When William climbed out of the water, he discovered that his heart was beating again. Afterward, he analyzed what had happened and concluded that sunlight had turned him back into a human. With a successful case right in front of him, Edward immediately began his research. Meanwhile, the blood shortage continued to worsen. The price of blood skyrocketed. Now a cup of coffee was only allowed to contain 5% fresh blood. Driven by their hunger, the vampires finally lost control. They began rioting on a massive scale. To solve the growing crisis, the owner of the blood harvesting company issued an order. His forces were instructed to hunt down every human still on the run. Almost instantly, an entire human refugee convoy was attacked. Everyone was subdued by the vampires. Meanwhile, Edward's research on William yielded no results, so he decided to recreate the original accident. Just then, an alarm sounded throughout the human settlement. The distress signal sent before the convoy was attacked had revealed their location. Everyone had to evacuate immediately. Humanity's situation was becoming increasingly desperate, and the chance they had left was their last one. To find a way to save everyone, Edward decided to stay behind and risk everything to complete the experiment. The vampire draped a wet cloth over his body. Then he stood by the window with his arms spread wide, allowing the sunlight to shine directly on him. The next second, his body burst into flames instantly. After counting down 3 seconds, the woman pressed a button to remove the air from the room, successfully extinguishing the flames on his body. Just like that, Edward transformed from a vampire back into a human. Before anyone could celebrate, a vampire search squad suddenly stormed in. The 3 quickly hid inside large barrels and narrowly avoided detection. Not long afterward, Edward stepped outside, enjoying the warmth of sunlight for the first time in years. Meanwhile, because of a severe blood shortage, large numbers of degenerated vampires began appearing on the streets. To contain the situation, the military stepped in, capturing and detaining these out-of-control vampires. But to restore them to normal, they would need to consume large amounts of blood. Yet even ordinary vampires could barely find blood to drink, let alone these fully degenerated creatures. In the end, they were dragged into the sunlight by force and burned into ashes beneath the blazing sun. After becoming human again, Edward decided to save as many people as possible. So he and Audrey went to a colleague's house and told him that vampires could be turned back into humans. Although the colleague appeared supportive, he immediately leaked the information to the vampire authorities. By the time Edward realized something was wrong, Audrey had already been captured. Edward rushed after them to rescue her, only to unexpectedly run into his brother. In the chaos, William was bitten on the neck, but the one who collapsed to the ground was Edward's brother. Watching the changes happening to his brother, Edward suddenly came up with a bold idea. After returning to the blood collection company, Edward attempted to use the human restoration process to save Audrey's life. At the same time, he and his colleague had successfully developed a blood substitute. However, what the boss cared about was never saving the world, but making more profit. As their final hope began slipping away, Edward deliberately provoked his boss, tricking him into biting his neck. While the boss was savoring the taste of blood, he suddenly realized something was wrong, because Edward's blood had turned him back into a human. Only then did everyone understand that the blood of a transformed human was the cure that could turn vampires back into humans. Not long afterward, a rescue team arrived on the scene. Seeing the boss inside the elevator, the surrounding vampires completely lost control and charged at him in a frenzy. Just as Edward was about to be attacked, his brother arrived just in time in a vehicle. Although he managed to save everyone, he became food for the vampires himself. And so, the cure began spreading throughout the population. More and more vampires returned to being human. Human civilization finally saw a long-awaited dawn. For a long time, vampires have been one of the most popular themes in film and television. They possess pale, glowing skin, strikingly attractive appearances, and an eternal life many people envy. But Daybreakers presents a completely different perspective. When humans become the minority, the once noble and elegant vampires can fall from grace due to a blood shortage. Some are even reduced to begging for blood on the streets, becoming the most tragic figures in this apocalyptic world.